Picture this. You're standing on an icy ridge looking down. Strapped to your boots are crude wooden boards driven through with rusty iron spikes. These improvised crampons bite into the frozen soil, keeping you rock steady. Below you, 9,000 of Europe's finest knights are sliding helplessly on the ice, their horses panicking, their steel boots finding no purchase. They have brought expensive ropes to hang you. You have brought cheap boulders to crush them. In the next few minutes, the old world order will be smashed to pieces by falling rock. This is Morgarten, and this is how a group of farmers executed the perfect ambush. Before diving into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history on Crimson Legacy Historians, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connect across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The date is November 15th, 1315. The location is a frozen nightmare along the edge of Lake Egerie. The geography here forms a natural guillotine. To the left is the freezing water. To the right, the steep timber-clogged slopes of Morgarten Mountain. Cutting between them is a mud track barely wide enough for 2 horses. Duke Leopold I of the House of Habsburg has marched his army directly into this throat. He isn't worried about tactics. He treats this as a hunting trip, a punitive expedition to discipline some rebellious peasants in the forest cantons. His column stretches for miles, a glittering ribbon of steel and silk. They are loud. They are confident. They're completely blind to the 1,500 men holding their breath. In the tree line above, the Swiss Confederates don't wait for a formal challenge. They don't wave flags. They simply cut the ropes. It starts with a rumble that vibrates through the soles of your feet. Massive tree trunks, stripped and piled high, begin to thunder down the slope. They gather momentum, snapping saplings like dry twigs, careening toward the packed column below. The impact is catastrophic. The logs smash into the center of the Habsburg line, shattering the formation instantly. Horses, terrified by the noise and the shaking earth, rear up. They slip on the icy road, throwing their riders. Armored men crash onto the frozen ground, unable to stand, crushed under the hooves of their own mounts. The column is severed. The vanguard can't move forward because the path is blocked by a man-made wall of debris. The rear guard can't retreat because the path is clogged with thousands of confused soldiers pushing forward. Chaos reigns, then the stones follow. Boulders the size of wine barrels bounce down the cliff face, punching through shields and crumpling helmets like parchment. The screams of men and horses drown out the orders of the commanders. The invincible heavy cavalry is now just a terrified mob trapped in a bowling alley. And then the Swiss attack. They don't march. They sprint down the icy slopes, their spiked boots giving them perfect traction. While the knights below are playing Bambi on ice, they hit the disorganized Austrians with the force of a freight train. This isn't a battle, it's an execution. The Swiss aren't looking for surrender. They wield halberds and morning stars, weapons designed to break armor and crush bone. A knight struggles to his knees, raising a hand to yield, expecting the civilized custom of ransom. A Swiss farmer answers by driving an axe through his visor. Blood sprays across the snow. The knights on the edge of the road are pushed backward by the crush. They topple into Lake Egerie. The water churns as hundreds of men weighed down by 60 pounds of plate and mail sink into the black depths. They don't even get to fight. They just drown, watching the surface disappear above them. In less than an hour, the myth of knightly superiority is shattered. The Swiss have turned the terrain itself into a weapon, and they are using it to dismantle the Habsburg army piece by bloody piece. But to understand why these farmers were angry enough to massacre the nobility, and why Leopold was foolish enough to walk into this trap, we have to look at the men who thought they owned the world. To understand the magnitude of the disaster, we must leave the bloody snow of Morgarten and travel to the marble halls of Vienna. We need to look at the victims of this massacre not as corpses, but as they saw themselves. The masters of the known universe, the House of Habsburg, was not just a noble family. They were a geopolitical inevitability. By the early 14th century, this dynasty was aggressively expanding its tentacles across Central Europe. They controlled Austria, Styria, and vast swathes of what is now Germany. They were the too-big-to-fail institution of the Middle Ages. Their power was backed by God, gold, and the heaviest cavalry in Christendom. At the center of this specific catastrophe stands Duke Leopold I. He is 25 years old. He is the younger brother of Frederick the Fair, claimant to the throne of Germany. Leopold is the archetype of the high medieval aristocrat, ambitious, impeccably bred, and dangerously overconfident. Historical records describe him as a man of action, eager to prove himself outside his brother's shadow. He possesses the best armor money can buy, and commands a retinue of knights who have spent their entire lives training for warfare. But Leopold has a fatal blind spot. He suffers from a condition that plagues many superpowers throughout history: the inability to imagine that a weaker enemy might actually fight back. When Leopold looks at the map of the forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, he does not see a sovereign territory. He sees a property dispute. These peasants hold imperial charters granting them freedom, yes, but the Habsburgs view those pieces of paper as administrative errors to be corrected. To Leopold, the Swiss are not soldiers. They are rebellious tenants behind on their rent. This mindset dictates his preparation, or rather his lack of it. When the Habsburg army assembles in the town of Zug in November 1315, the mood is festive. The knights preen in their polished plate and mail. Squires rush about polishing shields painted with lion crests and eagle emblems. They treat the upcoming march not as a campaign into hostile territory, but as a pageant. Pay close attention to what they bring with them. The baggage train is loaded with wine, fine clothes, and extra horses. Crucially, the manifest lists bundles of rope. These aren't for climbing mountains, they are for hangings. Leopold intends to capture the ringleaders of the rebellion, execute them publicly to restore order, and be back in a warm castle by Christmas. He brings no mountain guides. He establishes no complex scouting network. Why would he? You don't scout for cattle, you herd them. This arrogance trickles down from the duke to the lowest squire. The knights adhere to the code of chivalry, a system of ethics that governs how noblemen should kill each other. But chivalry has a loophole. It only applies to your peers. When fighting other knights, you show honor. When fighting peasants, you show the whip. They view the Swiss mountaineers as subhuman rabble-armed wit. Farming tools. Leopold's plan is devastatingly simple. He will march his massive force south from Zug, penetrate the mountains via the easiest route, and crush the resistance through sheer intimidation. He ignores the warnings of the few local lords who know the terrain. One legendary anecdote involves a warning about the past. When concerns were raised about the invasion plan, the warnings focused on how to get into the country, but none about how to get out. Leopold laughs off such concerns. He relies on the standard doctrine of medieval warfare, shock. The sight of thousands of armed men, including mounted knights, is usually enough to send any peasant army fleeing into the woods. He banks on fear doing the work for him. He's correct about the fear. The Swiss are terrified, but he miscalculates their reaction to that fear. Instead of running, the Swiss decide to corner themselves. Leopold rides out of Zug on November 14th. His armor gleams. His banners snap in the wind. He's leading the flower of Austrian nobility into a narrow frozen bottleneck, convinced he's walking into a trophy ceremony. He has no idea that he's actually leading the funeral procession of the feudal age. But the Swiss didn't just wake up one morning and decide to fight the emperor's brother. This collision course was set in motion years earlier, sparked by a violent raid that looks less like a battle and more like a scene from a Viking saga. History is rarely black and white, while it is tempting to view the Swiss purely as innocent freedom fighters defending their homes. The truth is grittier. The spark that ignited the bonfire of Morgarten wasn't a noble declaration of independence. It was a drunken, sacrilegious raid on a monastery. For generations, the people of Schwyz, one of the 3 forest cantons, had been locked in a bitter feud with Einsiedeln Abbey. The conflict was known as the Marchenstreit or the March Quarrel. At its core, It was about survival economics. In the Alps, flatland is gold. The peasants and the monks both claimed the same forests and pastures to graze their cattle and source their timber. Tensions simmered for decades. The abbot, protected by the Habsburgs, frequently complained to the emperor that the rude peasants were stealing his timber. The peasants in turn argued that the land had been theirs since time immemorial, long before the monks arrived with their quill pen and land deeds. Then on the bleak wintry night of January 6, 1314, Epiphany night, the simmering pot boiled over. Led by their landamman, Werner Stauffacher, a group of hot-headed men from Schwyz decided they had had enough of the abbot's threats. They didn't send a letter of protest. They launched a full-scale invasion of the Holy Grounds. They stormed Einsiedeln Abbey. This was not a polite occupation. The men of Schwyz broke down the doors. They looted the cellars, drinking the monks' sacramental wine until they were roaring drunk. They smashed relics, desecrated the altars, and ran wild through the cloisters. But they didn't stop at property damage. They rounded up the monks, dragged them out into the snow, and took them hostage. This act was political suicide. In the 14th century, attacking a monastery was equivalent to attacking God himself. The retaliation was swift and spiritual. The Bishop of Constance, at the urging of the Habsburgs, placed the entire canton of Schwyz under interdict. This was the nuclear weapon of the medieval church. It meant no masses could be sung, no babies baptized, no marriages blessed, and, most terrifying of all, the dead could not be buried in consecrated ground. To a deeply religious medieval society, the people of Schwyz were now spiritually dead, damned to wander hell for eternity. Eventually, the excommunication was extended to all three forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, because they refused to abandon each other. This is the crucible that forged the Swiss Confederation. They were now outlaws in both the physical and spiritual realms. This context is vital to understanding the savagery at Morgarten. When Leopold marched south a year later, he wasn't just coming to collect taxes. He was coming to execute heretics who had dared to touch the church. And the Swiss knew that surrender was impossible. You cannot negotiate when the enemy believes you're an agent of the devil. The raid on Einsiedeln had removed the safety net. The bridge back to peaceful coexistence had been burned, and the ashes were scattered in the abbey's wine cellar. With their backs against the wall, the forest cantons renewed their oath of alliance. They swore to stand together against the malice of the time. So when scouts reported that the Habsburg army was gathering at Zug, the Swiss didn't panic. They mobilized, but they were few and the enemy was legion. They needed a miracle. Or more accurately, they needed a mistake, and Leopold was about to give them a colossal one. On the morning of November 15th, the Habsburg war machine rolled out of Zug. It was a sight designed to inspire awe. The sun glinted off thousands of polished helmets, and the air was filled with the rhythmic clinking of mail and the heavy tread of war horses. This was the Golden Column. Leading the way was the heavy cavalry, the tanks of the medieval battlefield. These weren't just soldiers, they were the celebrities of their day. Counts, barons, and knights from across the Habsburg lands rode knee to knee, their shields emblazoned with the heraldry of ancient houses. They rode tall in their saddles, joking with one another, discussing the winter festivities awaiting them. Once this peasant annoyance was dealt with, behind the knights came the infantry, foot soldiers, crossbowmen, and servants, followed by a long, sluggish baggage train. In total, the line stretched for nearly 3 miles, but as they moved south along the shores of Lake Agiri, the road began to tighten. The wide plains gave way to a cramped, boggy track. To their rig, the dark waters of the lake lapped against the shore. To their left, the ground rose sharply into the steep wooded slopes of the Morgarten territory. The formation was forced to squeeze. The line of knights, once a wall of steel, thinned out into a long, fragile thread. In some places, they were forced to ride single file. This is the nightmare of any military commander, the bottleneck. In this formation, an army of thousands is effectively an army of one. If the front man stops, the whole army stops. If the front man is attacked, the thousands of men behind him can do nothing but watch. Yet, Leopold pressed on. He was blinded by the arrogance of knightly chivalry. In his mind, the Swiss would be waiting in a traditional shield wall on some open field where his knights could lower their lances and smash through them like a hammer through glass. The idea that the enemy might not play by the rules didn't register. There is a legend that persists in Swiss folklore about this moment. It is said that a warning was sent the night before bearing a cryptic message, "Watch out at Morgarten." But whether the warning was given or not, it was ignored. Leopold likely viewed caution as cowardice. By mid-morning, the vanguard of the Austrian column had pushed deep into the defile between the slope and the lake. The ground was frozen hard, slippery as glass. The horses struggled for a footing. The chatter among the knights began to die down, replaced by the heavy breathing of animals and the creaking of leather. The shadow of the mountain fell over the road, plunging the golden column into a gloomy twilight. They were now fully inside the kill box. Above them, hidden behind screens of air branches and snow, the men of Schwyz watched. They could see the plumes on the helmets. They could hear the voices of the men they were about to kill. They waited until the column was so deep into the pass that turning back was physically impossible. Leopold rode near the front, surrounded by his personal guard. He was arguably the most powerful man in the region. Yet, at this specific moment, he was the most vulnerable. He had led his men into a corridor with no exits, and then the mountain began to move. The attack does not begin with a war cry. It begins with the groan of timber. High above the road, the Swiss defenders sever the restraining ropes. Enormous tree trunks stripped of their branches and piled into unstable pyramids surrender to gravity. They tumble down the frozen slopes, gathering speed, tearing through the underbrush and transforming into unstoppable battering rams. The impact is seismic. The logs smash into the center of the Austrian column with the force of a train wreck. The result is immediate catastrophic biology. Horses are swept off their feet, their legs shattered. Men are crushed inside their armor before they even know they're under attack. The tight, disciplined formation of the Habsburg knights vanishes in seconds, replaced by a screaming tangle of men, tall and meat. Then come the stones. The Swiss have stockpiled tons of rock along the ridge. They rain down on the trapped soldiers like a meteor shower. This is where medieval warfare tactics fail completely. Plate armor is a marvel of engineering designed to deflect sharp edges, swords, arrows, lance tips. It makes the wearer a walking tank. But plate armor has a fatal weakness. It cannot absorb kinetic energy. When a 50-pound boulder drops from 100 feet up, it doesn't need to penetrate the steel to kill you. It simply caves in the breastplate, crushing the ribs and collapsing the lungs. It dents the helmet, fracturing the skull beneath. The knights aren't being stabbed. They are being bludgeoned to death by the landscape itself. The column buckles. At the front, the vanguard finds the road completely blocked by a pre-built wall of debris. They halt abruptly, but the thousands of men behind them, unaware of the carnage at the front, keep marching forward. The column compresses. The pressure becomes unbearable. Knights are pressed so tightly together they cannot draw their swords. Horses, maddened by the noise and the smell of blood, begin to kick and bite, trampling their own masters. The road becomes a slush of mud, snow, and blood. The trap is now sealed. The Habsburg army is paralyzed. The Golden Column has been turned into a stationary target. And then the second phase of the slaughter begins. The Swiss do not stay on the ridge. They draw their weapons and slide down the slopes. They move with terrifying agility on their spiked crampons, descending into the kill zone like wolves, dropping into a sheep pen. The knights look up dazed, concussed, and terrified to see a horde of bearded men rushing toward them. These attackers don't carry chivalric swords. They carry tools that look like they belong in a slaughterhouse. And the most terrifying among them is a weapon that's about to change the history of warfare forever. To understand why Morgarten shattered the medieval world, we have to zoom in. Forget the wide shot of the army. Focus on a single man. Let's imagine a knight near the center of the crush. We'll call him Count Wilhelm. He's a veteran of tournaments encased in a fortune of Milan steel. He is screaming at his squire, trying to turn his terrified horse around in the slush. In any other battle, Wilhelm is a god of war. His armor makes him invulnerable to sword slashes. His high saddle makes him a giant. But today, a man steps out of the fog in front of him. This man isn't wearing armor. He's wearing a rough wool tunic and those strange spiked boards on his feet. In his hands he holds a 6-foot pole topped with a piece of iron. That looks ugly, asymmetrical, and cruel. This is the halberd. It is the weapon that killed the Middle Ages. Count Wilhelm draws his sword, confident he has the reach. He has the height, but he doesn't understand the physics of what he is facing. The peasant swings the halberd. He doesn't aim for the knight. He aims for the horse's legs. The axe blade shears through the animal's tendons. The horse collapses, screaming. Wilhelm is thrown into the mud. He is dazed, weighed down by 60 pounds of metal. He tries to scramble to his feet, slipping on the ice. This is where the halberd's genius reveals itself. It is 3 weapons in one. As Wilhelm tries to stand, the peasant doesn't swing the axe. He uses the hook on the back of the weapon. He catches the rim of Wilhelm's shield, or perhaps the gap behind his knee, and yanks. The leverage provided by the 6-foot pole is immense. A slight pull from the peasant translates into hundreds of pounds of force. Wilhelm is slammed back into the filth, face down, now the kill. The peasant reverses his grip. He brings the weapon down like a wood splitter. The heavy axe blade strikes the back of Wilhelm's helmet. It might not cut through the steel, but the concussive force is enough to scramble Wilhelm's brain, paralyzing him. Finally, the spike. The peasant flips the weapon one last time. He finds the gap in the armor, under the armpit, at the groin, or through the eyelet of the visor. With a thrust of body weight, he drives the steel point home. Count Wilhelm, a lord of the realm, is dead. He was killed by a dairy farmer with a glorified tree pruner. This scene played out hundreds of times in the span of an hour. The halberd was the perfect answer to the knight. It gave a poor man the reach to engage a horseman safely, the leverage to pull him down, and the piercing power to finish him off. It turned the knight's greatest asset, his heavy protective shell, into his coffin. Once you're on the ground in the mud, armor isn't protection, it's a cage. The Austrian knights, trapped in the press, watched in horror as their comrades were hooked and dragged from their saddles like fish. There was no room to charge, no room to maneuver, just the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of halberds rising and falling, opening up the Austrian nobility like tin cans. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a technological revolution written in blood. The age of the invincible mounted knight ended here on a dirty road in Switzerland at the end of a 6-foot pole. As the initial shock of the ambush faded, the surviving Austrians attempted to do what they had always done when a battle turned sour. They tried to surrender. In 1315, warfare between noblemen was a business transaction. If you were a knight and you found yourself cornered, you would raise your visor, drop your sword, and shout your name and lineage. You would offer a ransom, a heavy purse of gold, a family ring, or the promise of future payment in exchange for your life. The victor would accept, take you prisoner, and later sell you back to your family. It was a gentleman's agreement. War was dangerous, yes, but it had a safety net for the rich. Morgarten cut that safety net to ribbons. When the Habsburg knights, trapped in the bloody slush, raised their hands to yield, they were met with confused stares from the Swiss. These mountain men didn't speak the international language of aristocracy. They didn't care about lineage, and crucially, they had no dungeons to hold prisoners and no extra food to feed them. So when a knight offered his surrender, the Swiss didn't see a bag of gold. They saw a man who had come to burn their homes. The chronicles described scenes of absolute horror. Knights screamed out promises of wealth, holding up jeweled daggers as payment. The Swiss answered with the halberd. They hacked down men who were already on their knees. They smashed the skulls of those pleading for mercy. There was no sorting of the dead from the living, no chivalrous pauses to let a worthy opponent rise. There was only the wet thud of iron on meat, repeated until nothing moved. This behavior sent a shock wave through Europe that was even more powerful than the military defeat. To the French or English courts, this wasn't war. It was a crime against the natural order. It was as if the sheep had not only killed the wolves, but had done so without showing the proper respect for the food chain. The Swiss ferocity was driven by a specific cold logic. They knew that if they let these men live, they would simply return next year with a bigger army. They had to make the cost of invasion so astronomically high that the Habsburgs would be terrified to return. They were sending a message written in the blood of the empire's finest. We do not play your game. This policy of no qua RT-Air fundamentally changed the psychology of the battlefield. The Austrian soldiers realized very quickly that their expensive armor and high berth would not save them. Panic, which had been simmering, now boiled over into absolute hysteria. If surrender was death and fighting was death, there was only one option left: escape. But the road back was blocked by the crush of their own army. To the right was the impossible mountain that left only one direction: the lake. The edge of Lake Agary became the final act of the tragedy. Driven by the relentless pressure of the Swiss advance, hundreds of Austrian knights were physically pushed off the road and into the water. In the summer, a swim might have been a means of escape, but this was November. The water was freezing, shocking the breath out of anyone who plunged in. And then there was the weight. A full suit of battlefield armor combined with the padded gambeson underneath, and the sword at the hip weighs anywhere from 60 to 80 pounds. On land, a fit man can run and fight in it. In the water, it is an anchor. The knights who fell in didn't splash and swim. They sank immediately. The chronicles paint a nightmarish picture. The surface of the lake churned as horses, maddened by wounds, thrashed in the shallows, kicking their own riders. Men struggled to undo their buckles with frozen fingers, gasping for air, dragging each other down in their panic. But the straps of medieval armor are complex. You need a squire to get them off. There was no time. Bubbles rose to the surface, followed by silence. The elite of Austria drowned just a few yards from the shore, watching the blurred shapes of the slaughter through the murky water. Above them, meanwhile, at the head of the column, the architect of this disaster was witnessing the collapse of his world. Duke Leopold I did not die at Morgarten, but the man who rode out of Zug that morning, the arrogant Golden Prince, was gone. In his place was a fugitive. Realizing the battle was lost, Leopold's personal guard managed to force a path back through the chaos, likely shoving their own men aside to clear a retreat route. The historical accounts describe Leopold fleeing the scene looking like death, his face drained of color, weeping with rage and terror. He had to ride hard over the difficult terrain, abandoning his army to the butchers on the ridge. By early afternoon, the screaming stopped. The silence that settled over the pass was heavier than the fog. The road was a ruin of smashed wagons, dead horses, and the broken bodies of Habsburg soldiers. The snow was trampled into a crimson slush. The water of the lake, usually crystal clear, was stained pink for distinct stretches along the shore. The casualty count was a statistical impossibility. The Austrians had lost the core of their nobility, counts, barons, and knights by the hundreds. The Swiss. Most accounts agree they lost about 12 men, not 1,200. 12, the survivors who limped back to Zug, brought with them more than just wounds. They brought a contagion of fear. They told stories of forest devils who couldn't be killed, who struck from nowhere, and who respected neither rank nor God. The invincibility of the Habsburgs had been left at the bottom of Lake Agary. But for the Swiss, the work wasn't done. They stripped the dead, taking armor, weapons, and jewelry that would fund their independence for decades. And as the news of their victory spread, it didn't just reach the ears of kings. It reached the ears of anyone looking to hire the deadliest soldiers in Europe. News of the massacre at Morgarten spread across Europe with the speed of a plague. In the courts of Paris, London, and Rome, kings and cardinals read the reports in disbelief. The narrative of the Middle Ages had just been rewritten. For centuries, the equation was simple. Heavy cavalry is greater than infantry. Aristocracy is greater than peasantry. Morgarten proved that equation was wrong. But something strange happened in the aftermath. The monarchs of Europe didn't just fear these mountain men. They wanted to buy them. This marks the birth of the most lucrative export in Swiss history. Swiss mercenaries. Before banks, before chocolate, and before luxury watches, Switzerland exported violence. The men of the forest cantons realized that the same skills they used to butcher the Habsburgs, discipline, terrain mastery, and absolute ruthlessness, were high-value commodities. Their land was poor, his soil was rocky, and the winters were harsh. But their neighbors were rich and constantly fighting. Morgarten served as the ultimate marketing campaign. It proved that a disciplined block of infantry could stop a cavalry charge dead in its tracks. Suddenly, every duke and king with a border dispute wanted a unit of Swiss soldiers in his vanguard. The Swiss evolved quickly. While Morgarten was won with the halberd, They soon adopted the pike, an 80-foot spear that allowed them to create impenetrable forests of steel. They developed the pike square, a formation that was essentially a moving fortress. It could roll over enemies like a steamroller. But their brand wasn't just built on tactics. It was built on psychology. Remember the no-quarter policy at Morgarten? That became their trademark. When you hired Swiss mercenaries, you weren't just hiring soldiers. You were hiring terror. Enemy armies would often break and run simply upon seeing the distinctive Swiss cross or hearing the boom of their war horns. They knew that if the Swiss won, there would be no ransom, no mercy, and no survivors. The Swiss cultivated a reputation for absolute contractual loyalty. They didn't fight for a cause. They fought for the paymaster. If you paid them, they would march into the mouth of hell for you. If you didn't pay them, well, no money, no Swiss became a famous proverb for a reason. This mercenary trade transformed the Swiss cantons. Gold from France, Italy, and the papacy flooded into He valleys. The simple shepherds who had crushed Leopold I became the power brokers of Europe. They dominated European battlefields for the next 200 years, influenced the rise and fall of kingdoms. Even the Pope, sitting in the Vatican, looked at the carnage of the 14th and 15th centuries and decided that the only man he could trust with his life were these mountain warriors. The pontifical Swiss Guard that protects the Pope today with their colorful uniforms and halberds is the direct living lineage of the men who stood in the snow at Morgarten. The victory at Lake Egerie didn't just save a small confederation from destruction. It launched a military-industrial complex that defined an era. The Peasants had proven that they didn't need knights to protect them. They could kill the knights, take their gold, and then take their jobs, but all dominance must eventually end. The age of the Swiss mercenary would eventually decline with the invention of gunpowder and artillery, which could blast apart their tight formations from a distance. Yet the spirit born at Morgarten, the idea of armed neutrality and fierce independence, remained. So what does this medieval slaughter tell us about the world we live in today? Today, if you visit the shores of Lake Egerie, the silence has returned. A simple stone monument stands near the road, overlooking the water. It is a modest marker for an event that turned the world upside down. Morgarten was more than just a clever ambush. It was the moment the Swiss Confederation proved its right to exist. It demonstrated that a small, determined population, leveraging their terrain and fighting with absolute ferocity, could defy an empire. This is a lesson that history repeats constantly. We see the echoes of Morgarten in the winter forests of Finland in 1939, in the jungles of Vietnam in the 1960s, and in the mountains of Afghanistan. It is the timeless doctrine of asymmetric warfare. When the little guy refuses to play by the rules of the big guy, the outcome is rarely certain. For the Swiss, Morgarten became the foundation of their national identity. It birthed the concept of armed neutrality. They learned that peace isn't granted by the goodwill of neighbors. It is secured by making yourself too painful to swallow. The Swiss became the porcupine of Europe. Peaceful if left alone, but deadly if touched. The knights of the House of Habsburg rode into that pass believing that their lineage and their expensive armor entitled them to victory. They died discovering that war cares nothing for titles. It only respects leverage, physics, and the will to kill. The 1,500 peasants who stood on that ridge didn't just defend a border. They shattered the feudal assumption that some men are born to rule and others are born to serve. They proved that free men fighting for their own soil are the most dangerous soldiers on earth. So the next time you look at the peaceful, postcard-perfect mountains of Switzerland, remember what lies beneath the snow. That peace was bought at a terrible price. It was paid for in the freezing mud of 1315 with the blood of princes, the swing of a halberd. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the brutal origin of the Swiss Confederation on Crimson Legacy Historians, you might be interested in my other videos dissecting the tactical failures of history's greatest empires. Click the video on your screen right now to see how another invincible army was destroyed by hubris. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. History is filled with forgotten warnings and we're going to uncover them all. I'll see you in the next one.